Mike Randall had long since traded the chaos of war for the quiet stillness of suburban life. After 12 years of service in the Special Forces, he'd learned to value peace more than anything. His new home, modest, on a quiet street, was supposed to be his sanctuary, his place of solace. The neighborhood was pristine, with well-kept lawns, neatly trimmed hedges, and little boxes of perfection. It was everything Mike hadn't realized he wanted until he'd found it. But just as soldiers learn that danger is never too far away, Mike soon discovered that peace was an illusion. Mike's daily routine had become predictable. He'd wake before the sun, lace up his old boots, scuffed but still reliable, and head out for a walk with his dog, Tank, a German shepherd that had served beside him in countless missions. The neighborhood was still asleep during these early hours, save for the occasional jogger or paperboy. It was during these walks that Mike could finally relax, his eyes on the horizon, his thoughts drifting back to simpler times. He didn't mind the stares, the curious looks from neighbors who weren't quite sure what to make of a former soldier in worn-out military garb. The clothes, though old, weren't just fabric. They were the story of who he was and what he'd been through, and in a strange way, they comforted him. But there was one neighbor who didn't look at him with curiosity, Margaret Lively. Karen, as the neighborhood had already dubbed her, had an eye for detail. From the moment Mike had moved in, she kept a watchful gaze on him, her sharp eyes always peering from behind the blinds. Mike had noticed her once, on the third day of his move-in, when she'd stood in her doorway, arms crossed, studying him like a specimen under a microscope. At first, he thought little of it. Everyone had their quirks. But as the days turned into weeks, Mike began to feel something else, a tension in the air, like an animal sensing a predator in the shadows. It wasn't just curiosity. Karen was watching him. And then, one morning, she made her move. Mike was adjusting the flagpole in his front yard, an American flag snapping in the early breeze. Tank stood by his side, sniffing the grass, as Mike ran his hand along the smooth metal of the pole. The flag had always been a symbol of pride for Mike, a reminder of the comrades he had lost, the battles fought, and the life he'd sacrificed. He was lost in thought, absorbed in the simple act, when he heard a sharp, high-pitched voice from behind him. "You need to take that down," Karen's voice rang out, cutting through the air like a whip. Mike turned slowly, surprised by her sudden presence. He had grown used to people avoiding him, but here she was, standing in his yard, looking down at him as if she were the one in charge. "Excuse me?" Mike asked, wiping his hands on his pants. Tank growled quietly, sensing the change in the air. "That flag," she pointed sharply at the American banner fluttering in the wind, "it doesn't belong here. This is a residential neighborhood, not a war zone." Mike's eyes narrowed. He'd been through hell to get home. And now, in his own front yard, someone was questioning his right to honor his past. His blood began to boil, but he kept his voice level. "This flag stays," he said, his tone calm, but firm. Karen wasn't done. Her eyes blazed with a smug confidence as she crossed her arms. "You'll be hearing from the HOA. This is a violation. You can't just put up whatever you want around here. It's a disturbance." A quiet rage simmered within Mike. He had seen countless enemies on the battlefield, but this was different. This was personal. This was his home, his sanctuary. And Karen had just made it clear that she didn't respect that. She turned to leave but paused, glancing back at him with a cruel smile. "You won't be wearing that military gear either. We'll make sure of that." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. As she walked away, Mike stood frozen, his fingers curling into fists. Tank barked once, breaking the silence, as if sensing that the battle had just begun. Mike stood there for a long moment, watching her disappear into her house. The quiet of the neighborhood felt suddenly deafening. His hands tightened around the flagpole, and a spark of determination flickered in his chest. Karen had just declared war. And Mike was no stranger to war. This was just the beginning. The days that followed were unsettling. At first, Mike had hoped Karen's words would be a one-off, just a brief, bitter encounter. But as the sun set on that first evening after their confrontation, a thick envelope appeared on his doorstep. It wasn't the usual mail. No, this was something else, something deliberate. The official-looking letter was stamped with the HOA's logo, bold and severe. Mike opened the envelope slowly, feeling the weight of what it could contain. As he unfolded the paper, the words jumped off the page. Violation notice, dress code, and property appearance. Immediate compliance required. He skimmed the rest of the letter, which outlined the supposed infractions he had committed: wearing military gear, displaying the American flag too prominently, and most absurd of all, walking his dog in the early morning hours, allegedly disturbing the peace. The letter ended with a warning that further action would be taken unless immediate changes were made. A fine, and worse, a mandatory appearance at the next HOA meeting to discuss his behavior. Mike stared at the paper, disbelief turning into irritation. This was ridiculous. His clothes, his flag, they were symbols of his service, his pride. Yet here it was, an official demand that he conform, that he abandon everything that made him who he was. He balled the letter into a tight fist and tossed it aside. Tank sat quietly at his feet, looking up at him with those knowing eyes, sensing the tension. Mike patted his dog's head absent-mindedly, but his thoughts were already racing. This wasn't just about a flag or a t-shirt. This was about control. The next morning, Mike took Tank for their usual walk. The air was thick with the pressure of the unspoken confrontation looming over him. As they passed the neighbors' houses, Mike noticed an unusual number of windows with shades drawn, curtains pulled tight, all eyes seemingly watching his every move. The feeling in the pit of his stomach was familiar. The sensation of being observed, evaluated. But this time, it wasn't the enemy on the other side of the world. It was the woman from across the street, the HOA president, and the judgment of a neighborhood that once felt like home. The tension was palpable, like a storm hanging in the distance, just waiting to break. Then came another knock on the door. This time, it wasn't an official letter. It was Karen herself, standing on his porch, her expression stone cold, a smirk playing at the corners of her lips. "Mike," she began, her voice dripping with an unspoken challenge. "I just wanted to personally remind you about the rules. You know, this isn't a military base. This is a community. We have standards. You've been issued your first warning, but you'll be hearing from the HOA again if things don't change." Mike looked her over, his fists clenching by his sides. He wanted to say something, to push back, but he could feel his instincts pulling him back. She was baiting him, trying to provoke him into a confrontation she could win. And he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Instead, he nodded slowly, his voice calm, controlled. "I've received your notice, Karen, but I'm not changing. I fought for this country, for the freedom to be who I am. I'm not going to hide that because it offends you." She raised an eyebrow. "We'll see about that." Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Mike standing in the doorway, the heat of her challenge hanging in the air. But this time, it was different. Mike didn't just feel anger. He felt something else, something deeper. This wasn't a small issue. It was personal. She had pushed him, but now he was starting to feel the stirrings of something far more dangerous. This wasn't just an HOA problem. This was a war he hadn't signed up for, but one that was already well underway. And Mike was just getting started. The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing day. Mike had hoped things would settle after Karen's last visit, but if anything, it only intensified. Every time he left his house, he felt the eyes of the neighborhood on him. Curious, judgmental, but never open. They didn't say anything directly, but Mike could feel it. Every step he took, every turn of his head, the stares followed him. He was no longer a neighbor. He was an outsider, a problem to be solved. One afternoon, Mike sat on his porch, sipping coffee and watching Tank chase a tennis ball across the yard. He tried to relax, but the uneasy feeling never quite left. It was like there was something, or someone, lurking just out of sight, watching him, waiting for him to slip up. He couldn't shake the sensation that his every move was being tracked. It was during one of these moments that Mike first noticed something strange. As he stood to get more coffee, he saw a man jogging down the street, but there was something off about him. The man's pace was too deliberate, his strides too calculated. He wasn't out for exercise. He was out for surveillance. Mike's eyes narrowed as the jogger passed his house, but the man didn't make eye contact. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, his expression unreadable. Mike returned to his chair, but something gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen the jogger before. His face was vaguely familiar. It was a fleeting thought, but it lingered in his mind as Tank padded up to him, wagging his tail. Mike absent-mindedly scratched the dog behind the ears, his thoughts racing. Could it have been someone from his past? Or just another coincidence? He didn't know. But the uneasy feeling in his gut told him it wasn't a coincidence. The next day, the strange jogger appeared again. But this time, he wasn't alone. A woman, dressed in casual military workout gear, was walking beside him. She seemed out of place in the quiet, suburban neighborhood, but it wasn't her attire that caught Mike's attention. It was her purposeful gaze. She looked directly at him as she passed, their eyes meeting for the briefest of seconds. It was a subtle exchange, but Mike's military instincts kicked in immediately. She wasn't just passing by. She was assessing him, sizing him up. Mike's heart rate quickened. The stakes had just gotten higher. Karen's tactics were becoming more calculated, more insidious. This wasn't just harassment. It was a game of chess, and Mike was starting to realize that he was a pawn. The following morning, as Mike and Tank headed out for their usual walk, he saw more unfamiliar faces. A man in a white t-shirt and sunglasses walked past him, the faintest trace of military insignia on the hem of his shirt. Another person, an elderly couple this time, strolled by, their movements too synchronized to be coincidence. They all seemed so normal, so inconspicuous. But Mike knew better. They were watching him. And this time, it wasn't just Karen. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He wasn't being paranoid. He was being hunted. That afternoon, he sat in his living room, staring out the window at the street. He watched as a few more people passed by. Neighbors he'd seen before, but hadn't paid much attention to. Now, he saw them differently. The seemingly normal jogger, the couple, the woman with the military leggings. They were all connected. They were part of something bigger. But what was it? What was Karen's game? Mike's thoughts raced as he sat back, gripping the armrest of his chair. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but he was still missing a critical part. He had a gut feeling that something far darker was at play here. And as the shadows of the evening lengthened across his front lawn, Mike couldn't help but wonder who else in the neighborhood was involved. And more importantly, who would be the next to make their move. The days were growing longer, the tension building like a storm that refused to break. Mike couldn't shake the feeling that every step he took, every breath he exhaled, was being watched. His once peaceful life had become a series of calculated moves, each one more deliberate than the last. But as much as he tried to ignore it, the harassment was relentless. The HOA notices kept coming, more frequent, more invasive, and always pointing out the smallest infractions that seemed designed to push him to the edge. The flags, the clothes, even the way he trimmed his hedges was now under scrutiny. One afternoon, after another terse letter arrived in the mail, Mike found himself standing at the door of his local police precinct. It had become impossible to ignore the situation any longer. His rights, his dignity, and now even his safety were at stake. He tried to handle things quietly, but Karen's influence was too strong, her campaign too coordinated. It was time to make a stand. The officer behind the counter greeted him with a polite smile that quickly faded when Mike explained his situation. The officer's expression turned serious as Mike laid out the pattern of harassment, the HOA citations, the threats, the strange neighbors, and, of course, Karen's escalating demands. Mike wasn't asking for much, just someone to acknowledge the absurdity of the situation and put an end to it. But instead of support, Mike was met with indifference. The officer hesitated, flipping through paperwork, eyes not quite meeting Mike's. "I'm sorry, sir," the officer finally said, "but this doesn't seem like something we can act on. It's a civil matter. You may need to take it up with the HOA or consider legal action." Mike's jaw clenched. "I fought for this country, for my freedom, and now I can't even stand in my own yard without being harassed by some woman who thinks she has the right to dictate my life." His voice was quiet, controlled, but the frustration bubbled beneath the surface. The officer shrugged, his face a mask of detachment. "There's not much we can do without concrete evidence. Maybe you should just lay low for a while." Lay low. The word stung. Mike had laid low his entire life. Too long, in fact. He'd walked away from his military past, hoping for peace, for quiet. But now he realized that peace had been taken from him, and that was something he wasn't about to let slide. Mike left the precinct with a burning sense of injustice, his mind racing. He wasn't going to let Karen and her unseen network bully him any longer. He had fought on battlefields where the odds were against him. This wouldn't be any different. In fact, he'd been trained for moments like these, when the enemy didn't play fair, when they hid in the shadows, manipulating from behind the scenes. Mike had learned long ago that if you couldn't defeat the enemy in plain sight, you went after them in the shadows. He walked out into the parking lot, his hand tightening around the keys in his pocket. This wasn't over. That night, as he sat at his kitchen table, the weight of his decision settled over him like a blanket. He wasn't a man to back down from a fight, not anymore. But this wasn't just a fight for his rights. It was a fight for something bigger, something he hadn't realized was still in him. A sense of duty, a sense of honor. And now he was ready to call in some old favors. It was time to remind Karen that she wasn't the only one with connections. It was time to bring in the people who had his back. The phone call was short, simple, and to the point. But when Mike hung up, his face was set in a grim expression. It wasn't just about the neighborhood anymore. This was war. Mike didn't sleep that night. As the darkness stretched over the neighborhood, his mind buzzed with a relentless hum of thoughts, ideas, and plans. The phone call had been brief, but the implications were clear. The person on the other end knew exactly what needed to be done. It was an old contact, someone from his Special Forces days, a man who had always operated in the shadows, taking care of situations that required a more direct approach. Mike knew what he was asking. He wasn't just calling in a favor, he was making the statement. The war had changed. The battleground was now his neighborhood, and his enemy was Karen. But Karen wasn't acting alone, and that's where Mike had the advantage. He knew how to find the people pulling the strings. By morning, Mike was ready. He'd made the necessary arrangements. Tank, sensing the shift in his master's mood, stayed unusually still at Mike's feet, his eyes watching him carefully. They both knew that the quiet days were over. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. Mike's plan was simple. He had 3 people coming, former Special Forces operatives who owed him. They'd work together in covert operations, never asking questions, never hesitating. Now, they would handle things the way they knew best, with precision and a quiet, calculated force that would leave no trace. As he waited for their arrival, Mike couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him. It wasn't just Karen now. The presence in the neighborhood had grown stronger, more suffocating. The subtle surveillance was no longer a figment of his imagination. It was real. He could feel it. And with each passing minute, the weight of his own decision settled heavier on his shoulders. A knock on the door broke the silence. Mike stood and made his way to the front, his pulse quickening. Tank growled low in his throat, sensing the unfamiliar visitors. When Mike opened the door, his former teammates stood before him. 3 men, each with a no-nonsense demeanor, and each with a look of familiarity that set Mike's nerves on edge. "Mike," said the first man, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a scar running down his jawline. "You called. We came. What's the play?" Mike didn't waste time. He explained the situation quickly, laying out the harassment, the HOA, Karen's escalating threats. The men listened intently, their expressions unreadable, but Mike could see the shift in their eyes as he mentioned the strange watchers in the neighborhood. "So it's not just Karen," the second man said, his voice low. "It's the whole damn neighborhood, isn't it?" Mike nodded. "They're all part of something bigger. I can feel it. Karen's just the pawn. But we need to find out who's really pulling the strings. And when we do, we're going to make them pay." The third man, a wiry figure with dark eyes, leaned in. "What do you want us to do?" Mike's voice was steady, but beneath it was a simmering rage. "We're going to make a few changes. We'll start with Karen. Subtle. No violence, just enough to remind her that she's not in control. Then we'll move on to the others. We'll find the people behind her, and we'll make sure they know not to mess with me again." The men exchanged glances, the understanding between them clear. They'd been in far worse situations than this, but there was something personal about this one. Something about it made it more dangerous than any mission they'd ever taken. Mike's eyes flicked toward the street. Through the blinds, he could see Karen standing in her window, her eyes fixed on his house, her gaze cold and calculating. She was waiting, watching for the next move. And Mike knew, without a doubt, that whatever came next, it wouldn't just be a battle for his peace, it would be a battle for his life. The SUV sat across the street for what seemed like an eternity. Mike's heart thudded in his chest as he watched it from behind the blinds. He wasn't sure who was in there. He couldn't see a thing, but he could feel the weight of it. A vehicle like that wasn't something you saw often in a quiet neighborhood like this. No one drove a car like that unless they had something to hide. Karen wasn't stupid. She knew Mike was watching, but she hadn't made a move. She couldn't know what he was planning. She couldn't know what was coming. Mike nodded to his team, signaling them to move. They'd be swift, deliberate, precise. They didn't need to engage in a direct confrontation yet. No, this was a battle of information. First, they would gather intel. Then, they would strike. The 3 men dispersed like shadows, blending into the neighborhood. They knew their mission well. Infiltrate, observe, and learn. Mike stayed back, his eyes locked on the SUV, his gut twisted with unease. It wasn't just the vehicle that unsettled him. It was the presence, the unspoken tension in the air. Whoever was behind that wheel had been watching his every move, every decision. Minutes passed, but the SUV didn't move. It sat there, like a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake. Suddenly, Mike's phone buzzed. A text. It started. "Be ready." His pulse quickened. His team was in place. It was happening. He glanced at Tank, who sat loyally at his side. The dog seemed to sense the urgency in the air, his posture alert. Mike took a slow, steady breath, focusing on the task at hand. This wasn't just a matter of revenge. It was a matter of survival. Across the street, the front door of Karen's house opened. She stepped outside, her eyes immediately flicking to the SUV. For a moment, she just stood there, as if she were waiting for something. But she wasn't looking for Mike. She was waiting for her own backup. Mike's eyes narrowed. This wasn't a random car. Whoever was in that SUV was there for a reason. And that reason had something to do with Karen. He moved quickly, slipping out of his front door and into the yard, trying to remain unseen. He crouched low behind the hedges and watched. As he suspected, Karen approached the SUV, her movements careful, calculated. She wasn't alone. There was someone in the vehicle now, a figure sitting in the driver's seat. The tinted windows made it impossible to see his face, but Mike didn't need to. He recognized the posture, the way the man sat, straight-backed, relaxed, but with the same predatory calm Mike had seen in the military. Mike's grip tightened on the edge of the hedge. His breath was shallow, his mind racing. This wasn't just some random neighborhood dispute anymore. This was something much larger. He could feel the weight of the conspiracy press down on him. His phone buzzed again. A message from the team leader. "We have eyes on the target. Moving in." Mike didn't waste time. He was already moving, creeping closer to the SUV. He needed to get a closer look, needed to know who was behind all this. Just as he was about to make his move, the SUV door opened, and a man stepped out, a tall, broad figure dressed in dark, tactical gear. Mike's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the man immediately. It was the jogger, the one who'd been watching him for days. But now he wasn't just a neighborhood observer. Now he was part of something far more dangerous. The figure spoke to Karen in hushed tones, gesturing toward Mike's house. Karen nodded and glanced over her shoulder, her gaze flicking in Mike's direction for a moment, but he was hidden behind the thick foliage. The pieces were falling into place. The tension in the air thickened as Mike remained crouched behind the bushes, every muscle in his body poised for action. He couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. The man in tactical gear, the jogger, had stepped out of the SUV with an air of authority. And Mike could see it now, the way he commanded the space around him. This wasn't a hired gun. This man had military discipline written all over him, and that could only mean one thing: the stakes were higher than Mike had anticipated. Mike's heart pounded in his chest as he observed their conversation. The jogger's voice was low, measured, but Mike could hear the underlying tension in his words. Karen, usually so composed, looked unsettled. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the surroundings like a cornered animal. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't good. Mike knew he had to act fast. He couldn't stay hidden much longer. If Karen realized someone was watching, he might lose the opportunity to strike first. Suddenly, the jogger's head turned, and for a split second, Mike felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. The man's eyes flicked directly to where Mike was crouched, the shadows thick enough to hide him, but not enough to shield his presence completely. The jogger's expression didn't change. His face remained unreadable, but Mike could feel the moment stretch out like a taut wire about to snap. Had he been spotted? Did the man know he was there? No time to think. Mike's instincts kicked in, and he slid deeper into the foliage, moving silently, each step calculated. He knew his best chance now was to stay invisible, to learn what he could without being seen. Karen and the jogger spoke for a few more moments before the jogger turned back to the SUV, his pace deliberate. Karen watched him go, her hands trembling slightly as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Mike could see it now, the shift in her demeanor. She wasn't just a neighbor with a vendetta anymore. She was part of something far bigger, something dangerous, and it was clear she wasn't the mastermind. The SUV's engine roared to life, and Mike knew it was now or never. His team would be in place soon, but he had to move fast to get the information he needed before they made their move. As the SUV drove off down the street, Mike followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows. His pulse raced in his ears as he darted between houses, making sure not to lose sight of the black vehicle. It moved with purpose, turning corners sharply, as if it knew exactly where it was going. He followed them for nearly 15 minutes, staying far enough behind to remain unnoticed, yet close enough to see the vehicle's movements. The SUV slowed as it approached a large, nondescript building, an office complex on the outskirts of the neighborhood. Mike's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just any building. It was heavily guarded, and the unmistakable presence of armed security guards suggested that whatever was happening inside was no ordinary business. Mike's breath caught. This was it. This was the moment that would change everything. He pulled out his phone and quickly texted his team leader. "We found the location. It's a secure compound. multiple guards. It's not just Karen's game anymore. Before he could finish, a cold voice cracked through the stillness. Did you really think you could follow me? Mike spun, his heart stopping in his chest. The jogger was standing behind him, his face inches from Mike's. You've been too predictable, the man said, his tone sharp, yet eerily calm. Now you've made a mistake. Mike's fingers twitched, reaching for the gun at his waist, but the jogger was faster. In one swift motion, he grabbed Mike's arm, twisting it behind his back. The pain shot up his shoulder, but Mike gritted his teeth, refusing to show weakness. You've been playing in the wrong league, soldier, the jogger continued, his grip tightening. And now, you're about to pay the price. Mike's mind raced. This wasn't part of the plan. Mike's mind raced as the jogger's grip tightened around his arm, pushing him toward the compound's entrance. Every instinct told him to fight, to break free. But the cold pressure of the man's hold reminded him that this wasn't just a street brawl. This was a calculated play, a high-stakes game where one misstep could mean his end. His eyes scanned the area, looking for any sign of his team. He had to keep his wits about him. He had trained for moments like this, moments where every second mattered. But he couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a second. The compound loomed ahead, its steel gates rising like a fortress. The guards were positioned at regular intervals, their eyes sharp, but they didn't seem to notice Mike and his captor. It wasn't just a building. This was something far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. You're making a big mistake, Mike growled, his voice low but steady. The jogger didn't respond. Instead, he pushed Mike harder, urging him toward the doors that led inside. Mike's heart thudded in his chest. Time was running out, and the walls were closing in. If they got inside, if they shut the door behind them, Mike would be trapped. Then, just as they reached the threshold, a sharp sound shattered the air, the unmistakable crack of a gunshot. The jogger froze. His head snapped toward the source of the noise. Mike saw his opportunity. Without hesitation, he slammed his foot down, using every ounce of strength in his legs to push back and break free of the jogger's hold. With a quick twist, Mike spun, sending his elbow crashing into the man's ribs. The jogger stumbled back, momentarily disoriented. Mike's hand shot to his waist, where his concealed weapon rested. In one fluid motion, he drew it, aiming it at the jogger. But the man was already recovering, his eyes narrowing as he assessed Mike with cold, calculating precision. You should have stayed out of this, the jogger hissed, his voice barely a whisper in the chaos. But before Mike could respond, there was a blur of motion, a flash of black, and then a powerful figure tackled the jogger from the side. It was one of Mike's teammates, a former sniper who had silently moved into position. The two men collided, and the gunfight that followed was a blur of chaos. Shots fired, the sound of bodies hitting the ground, the shrill alarm of security systems blaring to life. Mike barely had time to react before he was yanked to safety behind a nearby dumpster. His heart hammered in his chest, but his focus sharpened. He didn't have time to think about the fight unfolding around him. He needed answers. The compound was still standing, still filled with secrets he had yet to uncover. Mike, let's go, his teammate shouted, pulling him toward the rear exit. We've got what we need. Let's finish this. Mike hesitated, the sound of heavy footsteps and shouting guards closing in behind them. But he knew what had to be done. They weren't leaving without the full story. He had come too far to back down now. The team rushed to the back of the compound, where a small window of opportunity presented itself, a hole in the fence, a gap in the security. It was their way in. As they slipped through the narrow opening, Mike's mind buzzed. They had learned enough to know that Karen was only a small piece of a much larger operation. The compound was a front, a base of operations for an underground network pulling strings in more than just the neighborhood. It wasn't just about harassment anymore. It was about power, control, and secrets far darker than Mike had anticipated. They moved swiftly, cutting through corridors, their footsteps muffled by the sound of alarms blaring above them. And then, in the heart of the building, they found it. A room filled with files, encrypted documents, and a wall of screens, surveillance footage from every corner of the neighborhood. Mike stared at the screens in disbelief. They had been watching him all along. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. Karen was just a pawn. The real players were far more dangerous. The network they had uncovered wasn't just local. It spanned across the country. And now, Mike was entangled in it. Just as they were about to leave with the evidence, a voice echoed down the hallway. Leaving so soon? Mike's blood ran cold. It was Karen, but she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was the figure who had been watching from the shadows all along, the man in tactical gear, the one who had been orchestrating everything from the start. And now, the final game was about to begin.